and welcome. I'd like to begin with a couple of announcements, and then I will introduce our speaker. After this session, there is a session entitled, What is Theological About Theology? And the panelists are Andrea White, Kevin Hector, Oliver Crisp, and Sarah Coakley. That is taking place in Indigo E, but part of what will be, the main thing that will be on the table in that discussion is sort of analytic approaches to theology versus continental approaches to theology. So I figured I would announce this here because I think this audience may have some interest in that. After that session at 6:30 is the analytic theology reception, and that will take place in Indigo C, right next door. Everyone is welcome, even people who didn't attend the lecture, so if you have friends who couldn't make it to the lecture, feel free to bring them along. There will be food and drink and all that sort of thing, and of course, please come yourselves. The format for today will be lecture by Oliver for a while, and then Q&A where I will keep a queue and call on people, but I'll let Oliver answer the questions. So. All right, it is my honor and great pleasure to introduce Oliver Crisp as the 4th annual Analytic Theology Lecturer. Oliver is professor of systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. He took his PhD in philosophy of religion from King's College London in 2002 under the supervision of Paul Helm. Prior to his appointment at Fuller Seminary in 2011, he taught in the theology department at the University of Bristol, and he also held various research and teaching fellowships, including a teaching fellowship at the University of Aberdeen, the Frederick J. Crossan Research Fellowship at the University of Notre Dame, and the William Scheide Fellowship at the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton University. He is the author of 9 monographs in print, some half-dozen additional monographs that are forthcoming or in progress, 10 edited volumes, and close to 100 articles. He might have been a little more productive had he only been able to pull himself away from the beaches of Southern California a bit more often, but alas, one does what one can. As a scholar, Oliver is truly impressive, and if I may indulge a small personal note, I'll say too that as a person and as a friend, he is even more so. As one of the co-coiners of the term analytic theology and as one of the senior editors of the online open access Journal of Analytic Theology, it is only fitting that he at last be giving the annual Analytic Theology Lecture here at AAR. The title of his talk today is Ransom Enough? Please welcome Oliver Crisp.
Well, that's quite an effusive introduction. Thank you very much indeed, Mike, for those very kind words. Well, I'll just plow straight in. The ransom issue here is, of course, to do with the atonement, and that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. If you thought that ransom was about something else, then you're probably in the wrong room. Gustav Aulén closes his famous study of the atonement with these remarks about what he calls the classical account of the doctrine, what I take to be a version of the Ransom Model of atonement, and here I quote him without Scandinavian accent. I've tried to be consistent in speaking of the classic idea of the atonement, never of the or a classic theory. I have reserved the word theory and usually the word doctrine for the Latin and subjective types of doctrine of atonement. But the classic idea of the atonement has never been put forward like the other two as a rounded and finished theological doctrine. It has always been an idea, a motif, a theme, expressed in many different variations. It is not indeed that it has lacked clearness of outline. On the contrary, it has been fully definite and unambiguous, but it has never been shaped into a rational theory. Now, I presume that Aulén has in mind something like the following rough and ready distinction. An idea of atonement is a concept or notion that captures some central thought about a particular way of reflecting on the atonement that has not been developed into a model. We might think of such atonement ideas as motifs or pictures, that is, conceptual windows that offer a partial view onto some larger whole. I suppose that a model of atonement is a simplified description of the complex data of Scripture and the Christian tradition that bear upon this topic, on analogy with scientific models. Such models approximate to the truth of the matter and offer a far more expansive view of the larger whole. Thus, for example, Ian Barber, in commenting on the use of models in the scientific literature, says this: models and theories are abstract symbol systems which inadequately and selectively represent particular aspects of the world for specific purposes. This view preserves the scientist's realistic intent while recognizing that models and theories are imaginative human constructs. Models, on this reading, are to be taken seriously, but not literally. They are neither literal pictures nor useful fictions, but limited and inadequate ways of imagining what is not observable. They make tentative ontological claims that there are entities in the world something like those postulated in the models, thus Barber. Something similar, it seems to me, could be said about atonement models mutatis mutandis. But I would want to add this caveat: a theory is potentially more comprehensive than a model, being a system of ideas or a conceptual framework that makes sense of a lot of data in some overarching account of an area of intellectual endeavor. For this reason, theories are often thought to be more generalized than models, with the latter informing theories but being insufficient to generate a theory, whilst theories may have particular applications in models of certain data sets. Often in the theological literature on soteriology, one reads of theories of atonement. But on this way of thinking, it may be that model is the more accurate term. For we're trying to give a simplified description of complex data, and it may be that more than one model is required to do so. Of course, one might have a theory about models of the atonement, and there are such theories in the literature as well. Moreover, if, as is often claimed in contemporary work on the atonement, no one account of the atonement exhausts what can be said about the doctrine, it may be that the attempt to find an overarching theory of atonement by means of which to understand all the different data on the topic is a forlorn one. The search for a particular model that may approximate to the truth of the matter is, on this way of thinking, a more modest quest, and perhaps because of this, one more likely to succeed. What then of doctrines of atonement? In Christian theology, a doctrine is minimally a comprehensive account of a particular theological topic held by a particular communion. In his discussion of the nature of doctrine, George Lindbeck adds to this the notion that church doctrines are also essential to the identity or welfare of a particular community. But I think that's too stringent in the case of atonement. Although some account of atonement certainly is essential to the Christian faith, it's not clear to me that particular doctrines of atonement, particular construals of that central notion, as it were, are essential to particular communities. For the atonement does not have a dogmatic definition in many Christian traditions. In my view, doctrine provides propositional content to Christian claims about particular theological topics, claims that are truth apt. That is, doctrines are aimed at truth, they presume there is a truth of the matter, and attempt to express that in propositional form. Normally speaking, a doctrine of atonement implies a particular model for understanding this aspect of Christian teaching. Hence, we might say that St. Anselm's understanding of the doctrine of atonement implies a particular way of conceiving atonement, which can be expressed in a model for understanding the work of Christ, namely satisfaction. Aulin doesn't go into great detail about the difference between his use of idea and doctrine and so forth, but I think that what I have said here is consistent with the views he does state and captures his worry that an idea of atonement is much more provisional and incomplete than a doctrine of atonement. For an idea of atonement may provide a motif or picture of Christ's work without giving a worked-out mechanism by means of which atonement takes place. Which is just to say that an idea of atonement is not a doctrine of atonement, not a comprehensive account of Christian teaching on the topic, and not a complete model of atonement either, though it may be an aspect of a particular presentation of Christian teaching on the matter or of a model. In recent years, and in large measure because of the influence of Aulin's work, there have been a number of attempts to provide a rational theory, to use his term, of the ransom atonement motif. Indeed, one might talk of it as the doctrine of choice for a range of contemporary theologians approaching the work of Christ. Yet alongside this burgeoning work on the ransom view, there's not been a corresponding clarity about what we might call the mechanism by means of which atonement is supposed to obtain. To put it another way, often in reading accounts that purport to offer a ransom doctrine, rather than merely a ransom motif, one is left wondering how it is that Christ's work achieves the reconciliation of human beings with God. In the rest of this paper, I attempt to do several things to address this issue, which I take to be the most important issue facing those wishing to articulate a ransom doctrine of atonement, as opposed to utilizing a ransom motif as part of some larger, more comprehensive account of atonement. First, I shall set out 4 versions of the doctrine that can be found in the work of modern theologians. These are particular examples of what I shall call interpretive strategies for understanding the ransom view. They comprise the denial of ransom in order to make room for an alternative understanding of Christ's victory, the attempt to expand the ransom motif into a complete doctrine of atonement, the attempt to assimilate the ransom account to some other understanding of the atonement, and the attempt to relegate ransom to some less fundamental component, a rather different understanding of atonement. The first of these strategies is not a ransom view, strictly speaking, though, at least in the current literature, is often clothed in the language and conceptual trappings of the ransom view. The second is unsuccessful because, as we shall see, it's unable to move beyond a motif to a model of atonement. The third and fourth may provide ways in which to use ransom in constructive accounts of atonement as part of a larger doctrinal whole, and I shall indicate how this might be achieved. In a closing section, I offer some reflections on why this conclusion is important for contemporary constructive accounts of Christ's work. So that's where we're going. Let's turn then to the matter of the doctrinal form of the doctrine to look at those 4 views. Although Aulin and others in imitation of him speak of the ransom view as the classic idea of atonement, which rather begs the question, or the Christus Victor view, as well as the dramatic view, these are his terms, I take it that the central claim of this account has to do with the notion of ransom. Often it's expressed like this: Christ's work of redemption is fundamentally about him buying back human beings from the powers of sin, death, and the devil. His work is a ransom price that is paid to these powers in order that some number of fallen humanity may be redeemed from destruction and brought to salvation. As with contemporary hostage scenarios, in this model of atonement, humanity can only be released from bondage by the payment of a ransom price, and in this case, the ransom price is the redeeming work of Christ. Now let's call this notion that atonement is about ransom being paid to bring about human liberation from bondage to sin, death, and the devil, the core claim of the ransom model. In much historic discussion of this model, the core claim is embedded in a larger story about the aims and purpose of the work of Christ. Aulin places the core claim in the broader context of a story about the victory of Christ over the powers of sin, death, and the devil. The central theme of this dramatic view is, as he says, and I quote him, the idea of the atonement as a divine conflict and victory. Christ, Christus Victor, fights against and triumphs over the evil powers of the world, the tyrants under which mankind is in bondage and suffering, and in him God reconciles the world to himself. Close quote. He goes on to say, and I quote him again, this salvation is at the same time an atonement in the full sense of that word, for it is a work wherein God reconciles the world to himself and is at the same time reconciled. J. Denny Weaver, in elaborating on Aulin's Christus Victor idea, writes this atonement imaged, used, uses the image of cosmic battle between good and evil, between the forces of God and those of Satan. In the fray, God's Son, Jesus Christ, was killed, an apparent defeat of God and victory by Satan. However, Jesus' resurrection turns the seeming defeat into a great victory, which forever reveals God's control of the universe and frees sinful human beings from the power of sin and of Satan. The most infamous of these redemptive narratives in which the core claim is embedded is the bait and hook story of St. Gregory of Nyssa. In his great catechism, he says this, words that are probably familiar to many of you. For since has been said before, it was not the nature of the opposing power to come in contact with the undiluted presence of God and to undergo his unclouded manifestation. Therefore, in order to secure the ransom on our behalf, and in order to secure it that it might be easily accepted by him who required it, the deity was hidden under the veil of our nature, that so, as with a ravenous fish, the hook of the deity might be gulped down along with the bait of flesh, and thus, life being introduced into the house of death, and light shining in darkness, that which is diametrically opposed to light and life might vanish. Similar accounts can be found in a number of other patristic authors, including St. Irenaeus, Origen, St. John Chrysostom, St. John of Damascus, and even Augustine of Hippo, who writes that, and I quote, "As our price he held out his cross to him like a mousetrap, and as bait set upon it his own blood." Close quote. But clearly the defender of a ransom model of atonement need not hold to these rather lurid stories about divine deception of the devil in the incarnation. The core claim is independent of the particular stories in which it has often been embedded. This is important because some of the more superficial criticisms of the ransom view depend on the stories in which the core claim is embedded. For example, the objection that on Nyssa's bait and hook story, God appears to deceive the devil. The fact that the ransom account doesn't depend on any of these narratives means that such objections are beside the point in assessing its merits, for they're not part of its conceptual hardcore. But is ransom the core claim, or is it Christ's victory over sin, death, and the devil? Denny Weaver's view has been widely canvassed and discussed in the recent atonement literature. One of the key claims he makes is that his own brand of Christus Victor, which he calls narrative Christus Victor, does not imply that God is involved in a violent act in bringing about the death of Christ. This is a controversial claim, offered as a contribution to the contemporary debate about violence and atonement. It's not clear to me how the crucifixion can be regarded as anything other than an act of violence, and one that in some sense God permits for the purposes of reconciliation. But in fact, it seems to me that Weaver's position does not depend in any fundamental way on claims about violence in the cross, despite his own views to the contrary. The reason for this is that he maintains that his own brand of Christus Victor is not about the death of Christ at all, but about the reign of God, the unveiling of which can be seen in Christ's work in his life, death, and resurrection. He says this, here's a quote, "What this book calls narrative Christus Victor thus finally becomes a reading of the history of God's people who make God's rule visible in the world by the confrontation of injustice and by making visible in their midst the justice, peace, and freedom of the rule of God. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus constitute the culmination of that rule of God, and also the particular point in history when God's rule is most fully presented and revealed." And later he goes on to say this, "Since Jesus' mission was not to die, but to make visible the reign of God, it's quite explicit that neither God nor the reign of God needs Jesus' death in the way that his death is irreducibly needed in satisfaction theory. This represents," he says, "one of the most profound differences between narrative Christus Victor and satisfaction atonement," close quote. So according to Weaver, Christ's death was a consequence of his dedication to living out the reign of God. By accepting this mission, he acceded to death, which was a function of that mission, his words, not its goal. But if narrative Christus Victor is actually about the reign of God in history, exemplified in a particular manner by the life and work of Christ, where his death is not a goal of that work, not something necessary for that work, but merely a function of his faithfulness to his mission, then it's difficult to see how Weaver's narrative Christus Victor amounts to a ransom view of atonement at all. For Christ's work is not about reconciling fallen humans to God, according to Weaver, but about the culmination of God's reign on earth. In one respect, Christ is the victor on this view, the one whose work is the culmination of the victory of God's reign. But not because he offers himself as a ransom to pay for human sin. We might say that Weaver's position is a Christus Victor motif without the core claim, and therefore without being a ransom view at all. There are, however, those for whom the victory motif is more fundamental than ransom, though ransom still has a role to play. This is N.T. Wright's view, and he says this: "The cross is for Paul the symbol, as it was the means, of the liberating victory of the one true God over all the enslaving powers that have usurped his authority. For this reason, I suggest that we give priority, a priority among equals, perhaps, but still a priority, to those Pauline expressions of the crucifixion of Jesus which describe it as having the decisive victory over the principalities and powers. Nothing in the many other expressions of the meaning of the cross is lost if we put this in the center," says Wright. While divine victory over the powers of sin, death, and the devil is indeed an important biblical and theological component of the ransom view, which is why it's often called Christus Victor. But, so it seems to me, it is the upshot of that view, its consequence, not the view itself. In other words, it is because Christ's work is a ransom that he is victorious over these powers. Ransom is not merely one way of construing Christ's victory. It is the reason why his work is characterized as a victory over sin, death, and the devil on the ransom account. So Parche, Weaver, and Wright, to make victory a more fundamental component than ransom, is to turn this account of Christ's work on its head. Ransom is the core claim, victory is the result. Catherine Tanner has also recently argued that ransom is not, in fact, the fundamental motif at the heart of this account of atonement, but for different reasons. First, she demotes Aulin's argument in these words: Christus Victor is not a model at all, in that it fails per se to address the mechanism of atonement. Christ is battling the forces of evil and sin on the cross, but how is the battle won? Her question is rhetorical, of course, but the expected response is clearly, we don't know because we're not told. Tanner then provides an alternative. I quote her again. Aulin doesn't see, however, that the incarnation is the very means by which the fight is waged and won. The claim is fundamental, nonetheless, to the early church theologians to whom he appeals. All of them view the incarnation as the key to the salvation of humanity. Close quote. This is, in fact, the underlying mechanism of atonement in Gregory of Nyssa's bait and hook story on Tanner's way of thinking. A particularly vivid example of this can be found in St. Cyril of Alexandria's analogy of the iron in the fire, when he says this: there was no other way for the flesh to become life-giving, even though by its own nature it was subject to the necessity of corruption, except that it become the very flesh of the Word who gives life to all things. This is exactly how it accomplishes its own ends, working by his own life-giving power. There is nothing astonishing here, says St. Cyril, for if it is true that fire has converse with materials which in their own natures are hot, and yet renders them hot since it so abundantly introduces them to the inherent energy of its own power, then surely, in an even greater degree, the Word, who is God, can introduce the life-giving power and energy of his own self into his own very flesh. While adopting St. Cyril's view, Tanner says that Christ's atoning work comprises the whole of his life from the first moment of incarnation to his resurrection. It's not restricted to his work on the cross, as if that can be abstracted from his incarnate life as the particular event by means of which human salvation obtains. What is more, in the very assumption of human nature, there is a salvific communication of idioms in Christ, rather like St. Cyril's analogue of the iron in the fire, whereby the attributes of human life become the properties of the Word, and at least some of the properties of the Word become properties of humanity. Now, although she doesn't spell out exactly how this communication of idioms does the work of atonement, the idea, I suggest, seems to be this. In the very act of incarnation, God the Son purifies the particular human nature he assumes in such a manner that the properties of the resulting sanctified nature may be ascribed to other instances of human nature by his divine power. What is more, only by recapitulating each stage of human life in a sinless manner, and by dying and rising again, is Christ in a position to offer the salvific benefits of his perfect incarnate life and death to fallen human beings via this communication of idioms. For only by recapitulating human life and death and defeating death by resurrection can he be said to have sanctified the whole of a human life, the benefits of which may then be ascribed to other fallen human beings. It cannot be just in virtue of the assumption of a particular human nature that Christ brings about human salvation, even if the assumed nature is purified in its hypostatic union with the divine person. Such a physical account of the atonement, as it's sometimes called, the notion, in other words, that atonement happens by the mere assumption of human flesh, would leave opaque the mechanism by means of which the assumption of one human nature brings about salvation for other entities possessing a human nature in need of salvation. Tanner's account is more than a physical account of the atonement because she includes a notion of recapitulation, affirming the need for the life, death, and resurrection of Christ as aspects of the one work of atonement. Nevertheless, her patristic-inspired doctrine of atonement, which relocates the heart of the mechanism from ransom to the vicarious humanity of Christ, doesn't explain how it is that the assumption of human nature, or the communication of idioms in the person of Christ, or the recapitulation of the stages of human life in the life of Christ, brings about human salvation. Elsewhere, I've suggested that one way to repair Tanner's reasoning at this juncture is to introduce a clearer notion of representation. Then the communication of idioms, what she calls the wonderful exchange that obtains in the incarnation, may provide a basis for atonement because Christ acts as our representative in assuming a human nature. The saving benefits of the work of Christ could then be imputed to other human beings by the power of the Holy Spirit in salvation. Following Thomas Torrance, whose view is similar to that of Tanner in some important respects, we might dub this the vicarious humanity doctrine of atonement. It's not entirely clear, to me at least, how Tanner thinks this story goes, but perhaps it's analogous to this, and here's a sort of attempt to spin a story for you. Think of an Indian society. Vikram, a leading figure in Indian society, wishes to overthrow the caste system of India. In order to do so, he chooses as his bride a woman of the lowest caste, an untouchable named Indira, let's say. In marrying Indira, he marries one particular woman. Nonetheless, his action resonates beyond the change that marrying Vikram makes in Indira's life across the lives of all or many women of the lower caste. His action begins the process that will lead to their emancipation. It has whole caste consequences. Now, something like this story could be applied via Tanner's incarnation as atonement doctrine to the work of Christ. Like Vikram, God the Son unites himself to something untouchable from a divine perspective, namely a particular human nature that suffers from the effects of the fall, sanctifying it in the very act of assumption. But this particular action has much wider consequences. Through the assumption of the particular human nature of Christ, God the Son emancipates or begins the emancipation of all fallen human beings. His work has whole caste consequences. Admittedly, much more would need to be said if we were attempting to offer a complete defense of Tanner's account. For present purposes, however, it's sufficient to see that she construes Christus Victor as a species of the ransom view, which A, fails to comprehend what is most fundamental about the atonement, namely the very act of incarnation itself, coupled with the communication of idioms and a doctrine of recapitulation, and B, is an incomplete account of atonement without these elements. Her own view is, I think, suggestive and interesting, and really does capture something important about many of the patristic accounts of atonement that Aulon and his Epigone have overlooked. And like Tanner, I agree that the Christus Victor account does not provide a mechanism of atonement, and that for this reason is incomplete as a model of atonement, about which more presently. But it's not clear to me that her alternative plugs that conceptual gap. For it's not clear to me how God the Son's act of assuming human nature, plus recapitulation, plus the communication of idioms doctrine, actually provides salvation. This combination of notions may provide the raw materials for a mechanism of atonement. Nevertheless, it's still far from clear, given what she actually says, exactly how atonement is achieved. Let's turn to another view. Hans Boersma's work represents yet another attempt to rehabilitate Aulon's position in the recent literature. Although he thinks it represents, as he says, the most significant model of the atonement, he also maintains, like Tanner, that it doesn't explain how Christ gains the victory. Now, it's a strange model of atonement that does not provide a clear account of the mechanism by means of which Christ is said to bring about human reconciliation with God. So it's puzzling that Boersma thinks that this is true of the most significant model of atonement, since one would think that a significant model of atonement would offer a complete, developed understanding of Christ's work, including some story about the mechanism of atonement. However, on Boersma's reckoning, this is not the case with the ransom view. It requires supplementation by, once again, St. Irenaeus' doctrine of recapitulation in order to provide a complete account of the means by which atonement obtains. Christ's victory over the powers of darkness is the telos and climax of his work of capitulation, says Boersma. In other words, he continues, the victory is the result of the entire process of recapitulation. That's Boersma. Like Tanner, the Irenaean view Boersma has in mind involves Christ recapitulating each stage of our human development, providing a sinless template of human life, death, and resurrection, the benefits of which can then be transferred or imputed to fallen human beings. But as with Tanner, it's not clear how the addition of claims about the vicarious humanity of Christ, or about his recapitulation of each stage of human life, provides a work that atones for the sin of other human beings. Vicarious humanity or Irenaean recapitulation do not do this work without some further explanation about how it is that the benefits of Christ's work may be transferred from Christ to other fallen human beings in need of salvation. Unfortunately, Boersma doesn't seem to go beyond this in his provision of a better way of construing Christus Victor. Okay, that's a lot of survey, but I think it's important to see that there's a lot of work being done in systematic theology. I wanted to take that seriously. So let's take stock. From these cameos of different treatments of the ransom view, we may derive 4 interpretive strategies. The first of these distinguishes ransom and victory motifs in Christ's work, removes ransom, and provides a different account of the way in which Christ's work is a victory, one in which ransom plays no significant part. In fact, one in which Christ's death is no longer a necessary component. That's Weaver's position. The second interpretive strategy treats the ransom view as a distinct account of atonement with its own integrity, though it may be incomplete in important respects or in need of further development. That's Aulon's view. This usually involves placing the core claim within the context of a particular narrative about how salvation is brought about by Christ, such as that provided by Gregor of Nyssa's bait and hook story. The third strategy augments ransom with additional notions which are supposed to fill in the conceptual gap in the ransom account, providing a clearer mechanism of atonement. Thus, the assimilation of ransom to recapitulation in Borsma, or recapitulation plus communication of idioms in Tanner. Depending on how one construes matters, there may also be a fourth strategy here which, to all intents and purposes, eviscerates the doctrine, removes the core claim, and replaces it with a different mechanism of atonement, or relegates the core claim to some secondary status, substituting some more fundamental notion that performs what we might call the explanatory heavy lifting. You can see I spent too much time in SoCal, with regard to the mechanism of atonement. This, I think, is one way of reading Tanner's strategy in her vicarious humanity account. It's different from the first strategy in that it doesn't drive a wedge between ransom and victory, but makes ransom and victory two motifs that belong to some more fundamental understanding of Christ's work. The question is, are any of these strategies successful? As to the first, it should already be clear that this is not a ransom view at all, but a distinct account of Christ's work that retains some of the trappings of the ransom account, but where victory is the dominant motif. For this reason, we can discount it, because it's not a ransom view. The second strategy does not yield a distinct ransom model of atonement. The instances of the third and fourth strategies we've considered are also incomplete, though for different reasons. Although they assimilate ransom to some larger model, or relegate it to some secondary status in a model that is more fundamental, that has a more fundamental core claim about the mechanism of atonement, these larger wholes are still insufficient as complete accounts of atonement. For neither Borsma nor Tanner provide their readers with a clear mechanism of atonement, even when they augment ransom with additional notions, as in the case of Borsma, or displace it, making some other related understanding of atonement more conceptually fundamental, as with Tanner. Nevertheless, the direction in which the strategies of Borsma and Tanner point is, I suggest, the right one. The way to understand ransom is not as an atonement model as such, let alone as an atonement doctrine, but as an atonement motif. To this I would add the following. Ransom is a motif about one consequence of atonement, namely the victory of Christ over sin. It is not a motif about the nature of atonement per se, but about its upshot. In the next section, we'll set out one way of understanding ransom in this manner, and that's what I turn to do now. Okay, let's recall that the core claim of the ransom view was something like the following, and here I'll just reiterate the core view. Christ's work of redemption is fundamentally about him buying back human beings from the powers of sin, death, and the devil. His work is a ransom price that is paid to these powers in order that some number of fallen humanity may be redeemed from destruction and brought to salvation. That's the core claim, as I understand it. Now, there's a significant problem with the core claim as it stands, having to do with the reification of the powers to whom Christ's ransom is paid. It's not clear to me how sin and death are powers to which a ransom should be paid for the release of human beings. Nor is it clear to me why the devil should be paid a ransom for the release of human beings. True, Scripture speaks of human in bondage to sin, of death as the wages of sin, and of the devil as the tempter. All three are spoken of, as we saw N.T. Wright affirming earlier, in semi-personal terms in the biblical record as powers and principalities. Whatever one makes of this, and to be frank, I'm not sure what to make of it, what seems to me to be the most fundamental problem with the core claim is that it says ransom is paid to these powers in Christ's work of redemption. It's not at all clear to me how Christ's work could be a ransom that is paid to such powers, or even how such powers might be said to be paid off by means of Christ's work, beyond some sort of poetic or rhetorical claim, similar to the idea that religion is the opiate of the masses. More problematic, perhaps, how does paying a ransom to sin, death, and the devil produce reconciliation with God? I don't think sin and death are entities with whom one can enter into a transaction. Sin is, according to one confession at least, a want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God, thus the Westminster Shorter Catechism. This isn't a power in the sense of some semi-personal principality, but a moral state, and one can hardly enter into transactions with moral states, for they aren't agents. Similar considerations apply to death, which is just the cessation of the life of an organism or body. One cannot enter into transactions with the absence of bodily life. That's meaningless. As to the devil, a very foolish person might enter into a transaction with him, but why would God do so? And what sound theological reason is there for thinking that human beings sold themselves into slavery to the devil upon commission of original sin, so that they must be bought back from him at such a terrible price? This, it seems to me, is pure sophistry. God does not transact with the devil for human salvation, for as St. Anselm of Canterbury, peace be upon him, made plain in Cur Deus Homo 1:7, both fallen humans and the devil belong to God. And here's a little excerpt from Anselm. It's always a delight to quote the magnificent doctor. But since, in fact, neither the devil nor human beings belong to anyone other than God or stand outside God's power, says Anselm, on what grounds was God obligated to do anything with his own, about his own, or in his own, other than to punish his own slave who had persuaded a fellow slave to abandon their common master and transfer allegiance to him, a traitor harboring a fugitive, a thief who received a thief, along with what he had stolen from his master? For both of them were thieves. So it's at one thief's persuasion, the other thief stole himself from his master. Thus Anselm. But perhaps we can demythologize the core claim, denuding it of reference to powers with whom Christ pays a ransom. Let's call this the demythologized core claim for all you Bultmannians out there. And it goes like this. Christ's work of redemption can be pictured as him buying back human beings subject to sin and death. It's like a ransom price that is paid out in order that some number of fallen humanity may be redeemed from destruction and brought to salvation. That's it. But once we exchange the core claim for this demythologized core claim, it becomes clear why ransom is no more than an atonement motif. It provides no mechanism of atonement. Its language is metaphorical, comparative, unfitted to giving us a clear basis for the doctrine of atonement, doctrine in the technical sense that I'm using here. However, it may be regarded as an auxiliary claim about the outcome of atonement. The upshot of Christ's work is indeed the release of human beings subject to sin and death. When viewed in these terms, his work is a ransom price of sorts, is the price requisite to bring about human reconciliation paid by Christ. He is our substitute. He represents us in atonement. But it's not a ransom in the sense that it really is a work equivalent in value to the price fixed for the ransom of some number of fallen humanity from some other power, whether sin, death, the devil, or God. Hence, when we read in Mark 10:45 that the Son of Man came not to be served but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many, or in Colossians 1:13 that he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, as well as this from Colossians 2:15, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. I presume we should understand such passages as conveying a picture of Christ's work. The picture is this. In his life, death, and resurrection, Christ somehow brings about human reconciliation with God, buying us back, as it were, at the great price of his own life in an act of vicarious supererogation. To close, I've argued that ransom is an atonement motif, not a model or doctrine of atonement. Thus, Allen was right to say it's not an historic doctrine of atonement, but wrong to think that more work on the motif would produce a complete model in due course. The main reason for this is that ransom doesn't provide a distinct mechanism for atonement. It's merely a motif. What's more, it's a motif about the upshot of Christ's work, not about its nature. Finally, I'm in agreement with critics of ransom who argue that it is not, as it is often claimed, the patristic doctrine or the most common patristic doctrine of Christ's work. It is an ancillary motif in a number of patristic accounts. These writers did not have carefully worked out accounts of the atonement. What is more, there are several other atonement themes in patristic theology, including the Irenaean recapitulation view, beloved of Boersma, and the notion of vicarious humanity that has recently been developed by theologians like Torrance and Catherine Tanner. It may be that these themes do provide the elements of a distinct doctrine of atonement, but if they do, it's not the ransom view, which was only ever an idea in search of a model of atonement. Thank you.
We have time for questions. There's a roving microphone since this is being videotaped and recorded. I will try to both keep a queue and make the microphone rove. Somehow people will get to ask questions. We'll start with, please keep your hands up. When you see me nod at you, I will have made a note of you and then you can put your hands down.
Yeah. It's been 50-some years since I read Aldain's Christus Victor, so I'm rusty on the details. But I have to say I came away from it with the impression, suggested in a way by his title, that the central motif was in fact not ransom, which was the way the devil was tricked,
Right.
but Christus Victor, that is to say, triumph over powers of evil. And I want to make a suggestion, namely that we might question whether it's a criticism of the view that it doesn't provide an explanation of
Right.
our reconciliation with God, or a solution to the problem of guilt, but that it provided in the minds of many ancient Christians and medieval Christians a picture of God's solution through Christ to a problem of human bondage to powers of evil, which they saw as separate from the problem of guilt. I mean, it wasn't just a problem of guilt, it was a problem of powers of evil. And that, one evidence that this isn't just a sort of matter, a technical, theoretical matter of doctrines that the fathers thought up, but of a sort of lived religion, is what you can observe in the change in the character of crucifixes in Western Europe, sometime around the 12th or 13th century, where before that, they focused on a visibly triumphant image of Christ. The theme of how much it hurt Jesus was hardly there. And in the later Middle Ages and in the early modern period, that got sort of swallowed up in crucifixes, and how much it hurt Jesus was sort of everything, which perhaps fit a picture of Christian salvation in which atonement for sin was the whole story, but it hadn't been in the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And that sort of leaves me with the question, do we in fact have room in our theology for triumph over powers of evil, or as a separate motif, or do we see that as a blind alley in which our faith has to be very different from that of pretty clearly a large part of the first 1,000 years of Christianity?
Yeah. Thank you very much. There's a number of things in there, but that's very helpful. This microphone sounds like the other end is connected to Godzilla's heartbeat or something. I don't know if you can hear this. It's very disconcerting, but we'll try to ignore it. So I took it that one of the first thing you were talking about was whether as I've characterized Aulin's view, it's fair to say that ransom is really, the kind of conceptual core claim, and that really maybe victory is doing a lot more work. I guess that is how some people have understood our lane, and I suppose that's something of why Weaver goes in the direction that he does. But it's not the only way to understand our lane. And even people who've who were reading our lane earlier in the 20th century, people like Grenstead, who's written a little short work on the history of the atonement, it's clear that really at bottom the core is a ransom view. It's a transaction of sorts, and that's what's driving the account. My view is that that's right, that Grenstead is right, that really what we find in our lane is an attempt to recommend this, what he calls the classic view and so on, but that really, although he characterizes it as Christ's victory and the victory of Christ is what he's trying to get at, when he starts talking about how it is a work of atonement, he's got to search around for something more than Christ is the victor over the powers. And what he fetches up upon is some notion of ransom. But I think I was trying to indicate in my sort of cameo of 4 different options in the recent literature that it is possible to separate out ransom from victory. And some have done that. I think that's problematic, and the reason why I think it's problematic is because if victory is doing a lot of the work for you, or even all of the work, it's not clear to me how that constitutes more than a motif. And in my view, it's a motif about the upshot, not the nature of atonement. I mean, the idea is that the end, the goal, as it were, is that Christ triumphs over however you construe these powers. What I want to know is, how does he get there? What's the nature of atonement? What's the mechanism by means of which Christ may be said to be victor over the powers? And that's the issue that I think, if you press these various construals of the ransom view, this kind of family of atonement views, if you like, when you press on it, it's not entirely clear what the response is. But I think what you say about the notion of evil is really important, and I worry a bit about Christian understandings of guilt, and particularly things like original guilt and things like that play an important role in a number of Protestant views of the atonement, and whether original guilt is a helpful way to think about what it is that Christ's work atones for. And it certainly seems to me that one of the contributions of this motif, the ransom motif as I'm calling it, is that it points to something that people like Wright are right to say, it's in the New Testament here, and we can't sort of whitewash that and pretend it's not there, that there is an aspect of Christ's work that attends to evil per se, not just necessarily the evils of particular human beings, but something greater than that. But then the question is, what is the greater than that we're talking about? I mean, some people like Sally McFague simply say, well, she's a revisionist theologian, she simply says, well, we have to get rid of those sorts of ideas. This is a motif that's not terribly helpful. But then her account of doctrine is not necessarily realist in nature. She doesn't seem to think that her motifs, including her motif of the atonement in Models of God, her book on this subject, is truth apt, and I want to have a model of atonement that's truth apt. So do we have room for the triumph over evil in an account of the atonement? We surely must have, I think, since the New Testament does, but not as the nature, but the upshot. Thank you for that.
Andrew.
First of all, thank you, Oliver, for a very clear exposition, a very good advertisement, by the way, for analytic theology. I want to add one more ingredient to the mix, and it's a question that's suggested to me, first of all, by Eleanor Stump, which is why Jesus suddenly begins to be anguished in the Garden of Gethsemane. Maybe it's the imminence of his death, but there's a curiosity there. Why is it sudden? What has he just done? And, well, he has just instituted the Eucharist. And what happens at the Eucharist? Well, in some way he communicates his life to us. But what else happens? Perhaps we communicate our death to him, our sin to him. So if you're looking for a mechanism, it may be worth looking at that aspect of what happens in the drama.
Yeah, I like that idea. In fact, I'm trying to work on a larger project. I know Eleanor's writing a book on the atonement as well. But one of the things I'm zeroing in on is whether it's possible to have an account of the atonement that brings in some of this patristic material, particularly a version of recapitulation, where there's some real transference between us and Christ, so a kind of realist account of atonement, rather than some account according to which something is imputed from us to Christ and something is imputed from Christ to us. Because my concern there, maybe this is Eleanor's concern, is that trades on a sort of moral or legal fiction, and I worry a little bit about fictions that appear in both the doctrine of sin and the doctrine of the atonement, at least in the sort of Protestant tradition that I'm most familiar with. So thank you very much for that, and I will certainly take that on board.
David.
Thanks, Oliver. As a resident Boltmani, I'm happy for.
Yeah, I didn't see you there. Yeah.
My question actually had to do with your discussion of the vicarious atonement, vicarious humanity atonement theory. I'm not a defender of it myself, but I do want to press. I mean, maybe I misunderstood you, but it does seem to me like there is a mechanism there, and I wanted to hear you say more about the communicatio idiomatum. It seems to me that the mechanism there is an exchange of properties, and if our humanity, if there's a universal human essence that Christ assumes, then it seems to me that the mechanism precisely is that communication in which we do receive Christ's benefits and Christ takes on our sin in our death. So I'm wondering why you don't think that works as a mechanism to achieve atonement.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I like that aspect. I think I said in the paper that I think there's the beginnings of a mechanism for atonement in someone like Tanner's work, and I'm very sympathetic to Tanner's work. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Tanner's theology per se. I think she's a terrific theologian. But I guess I wanted her to say more. She's got these elements here, but it wasn't always clear to me. I'm thinking both in her earlier short systematic theology, but also in Christ the Key more recently. It wasn't always clear to me how you could sort of somehow meld these aspects together or provide some unifying whole out of these parts, something like that. And then if you provide the unifying whole, what it is that's doing the work, what it is that's doing this heavy lifting. Maybe some account of communication of idioms can do that. And maybe that could factor into something like what should we say? Well, let's say, call it a realist account of atonement. Realist in the sense that there's a real union between Christ and those he comes to save. And maybe if you thought about it in those terms, then the communication of idioms would be an important aspect of that. And it might just be that further work on her part will deliver that thing that seems to be missing at the moment. I mean, I'm quite prepared for that to be the case, in which case I'd be delighted. So I think my sense there is that there's a kind of lacuna. It's not that she's not going in the right direction. I mean, this is, for what it's worth, that's my view anyway. But that there's something that may be missing, and I kind of want to press someone like Tanner a little bit further to say more, because I think her account of atonement is suggestive in all sorts of ways, and may solve other sorts of problems, like this kind of whole thing about violence and atonement and so on. She can sidestep a lot of that by saying what she does, and I think that might be very helpful.
All four people in my queue are still from this side of the room, so I wanted to let you all over there know that I can walk over there with the microphone.
Thanks, Oliver. That was a really interesting paper. And thanks for telling us what the core claim of the doctrine is not. I was wondering if you have the time or inclination to tell us what it is, and you could tell us what the exact mechanism is that you think is at work. And don't use expressions like in some way communicated, some real transference or other, something somehow imputed, somehow exchange, and those sorts of expressions in the statement of the mechanism.
How untypical of you to ask that kind of question, Dan. Thank you. So what's my view of the mechanism? Well, it would seem a little bit of a weasel's get-out to say I'm working towards an account. I mean, I do have a published view in the... Okay, appreciate that. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, okay, thank you, I appreciate that. So I have said something about this along the way to this larger project. In the Oxford Handbook of Philosophical Theology, I wrote a paper on atonement, which tried to set out what I, at the time, took to be a version of penal substitution, because I come from that kind of constituency, a kind of reformed evangelical constituency, so it was, penal substitution is the way to go. But as a graduate student at, not my graduate student, but a graduate student at Fuller pointed out to me, when he'd read it, it's not really a penal substitution view, it's something else. Because what I was doing was trying to, as I said in response to Andrew's question, trying to remove these notions of imputation that I think that have problems, and set up some account of the atonement that's kind of analogous to the relationship between between Adam and his offspring in traditional versions of so-called Augustinian realism. So Augustinian realism is roughly the idea that somehow Adam's progeny are included in one metaphysical whole with Adam, so that Adam's original sin can be transferred to them without necessarily incurring problems to do with, how is it just or moral for God to impute someone else's sin to me that I never authorized, who lived thousands of years ago, and so on. Now, bracket whether or not there is a historic Adam. I don't think that really matters. I can go into why, but no, it seems to me that there's an interesting account of the transmission of sin there that may avoid some problems with imputation, if you think imputation is a problem. What I found interesting was, the more I delved into this in the history of the tradition, was that those who took the kind of Augustinian realist account, or some version of it, with respect to the transmission of Adam's sin to his progeny, stopped short of transposing that onto Christ and his elect. They were happy to, some of the more heroic of them perhaps, were willing to say something about the mystical union and that sort of stuff. But I thought, well, maybe it would be interesting to try and see if there's a way of construing Christ's atonement which works on a similar basis to the transmission of original sin from Adam to his progeny. So there's a real union between us and Christ. So that was what I was trying to do in the Oxford Handbook paper. And as I say, I started off thinking that was a version of penal substitution, leaving out the imputation language, bringing in some Augustinian realist language, but maybe it's doing roughly the same thing. But actually, the more I think about it, the more I think it's much closer to some of these patristic ideas of things like recapitulation, and the kind of what's sometimes called the sort of mystical theory of the atonement, whereby somehow Christ and us and we are joined together in one mystic whole in the atonement. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is push beyond that 2009 article to develop an account of the atonement which draws on some of the recent stuff like Boersma and Tanner in particular, and provides an account of atonement that makes good on that initial story, that maybe doesn't have some of the potentially troubling consequence that a realist account might have. For example, does this make Christ a sinner? Does this mean I'm hypostatically united to the second person of the Trinity, or things like that, weird stuff like that? I don't think it does, if you carefully parse out the parts-whole relation, right, between the composite whole that might be Christ and his elect. But so that's a very rough and ready beginning of something, but it's a work in progress.
Marilyn.
Just back to the mechanism of the defeat of the victory, it seemed like the passage that you quoted, I think from Colossians, about Christ making a laughing stock,
of the principle.
already suggests the mechanism, which is the powers of evil have a certain amount of ammunition, and he puts himself as the target of the ammunition. They spend their ammunition, and therefore they have no more power to attack the others.
Yeah.
And he rises from the dead, and so isn't that the mechanism that's suggested by quite a few New Testament passages, that basically the powers of darkness do their worst? But and Christ is the target for it and absorbs all the force of it. And
so are you suggesting, Marilyn, that that's a way of understanding the ransom view, or just these passages of the New Testament?
well, you could take it either way.
Okay,
But
yeah.
you were complaining that there was no
I see, yeah,
mechanism
yeah.
suggested. and
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
thinking,
good.
You were also suggesting there were no power, there was no such thing as death, and no such thing as
Well,
sin,
I didn't
so-
say there was no such thing as death. I said
as
that
a-
death doesn't exist as a power or as an agent that you can transact with.
Well, so of course, I mean, I think that, powers of evil, it's a way of referring to powers of evil. So I was thinking,
Yeah.
okay, they're the powers of evil, and there is a mechanism, and it could be plugged into a ransom theory
Yeah,
or
good.
a victory theory if
Yeah.
you want, or
Yeah.
a motif or a whatever you want to call it. But
Yeah.
but it wasn't as if there was no mechanism.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. I suppose my response to that is, it's not clear to me that if the powers of evil are expending their ammunition against Christ, who's some kind of like Kryptonian who, either absorbs bullets or they bounce off his Kryptonian hide or something like that. They don't bounce off his Kryptonian hide. No, of course they kill him. They kill him. So somehow he absorbs the ammunition, he dies, and then it's like the Gran Torino all over again, right? He gets up again. Yeah, maybe that's right. Maybe. I know it's a travesty. I know. I was attempting a gag here. This is a very serious gathering. So let's say something like this. See if this is right, Marilyn. He takes upon himself the attacks of evil, right? And that includes his dying and rising again, defeating evil, something like that. Is that the idea?
The idea is they spend all their ammunition, they ain't got no more.
Right.
And it doesn't succeed in doing him in permanently because
Right.
he rises
Yeah,
from the
good,
dead.
good.
God raises him up.
Yeah, right, yeah. Now, that's all good. I want to affirm that, and I think I did say that I want to affirm that, but maybe there's a way in which I could say more about that would bring it into what Christ's work achieves. But my concern with that is still this, that it's not clear to me how the powers of evil, as it were, if there's something distinct from human agents, expending their ammunition against Christ, is an action which performs atonement for me.
What it does is release you from the bondage of the powers because it deprives them of the power
Right,
to keep you in bondage.
right. But
Which is different from performing atonement if you mean solving the guilt problem.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
making your relationship with God cozy or something
Something
like
like
that.
that,
Then
yeah,
that's a different problem.
Yeah, so I have something more like the latter problem in mind. I can see that you could have a notion where the powers of evil are somehow defeated by Christ's work. That seems right, and that seems to be consistent with what we find in the New Testament. But I want to say that there's something more to be done in order for me to be reconciled with God, because it seems to me that if sin is any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God, that's something that I myself am performing or failing to perform with respect to God and his moral law. So there seems to be something there, something amiss between my relationship, something disrupted in my relationship with God that needs to be mended. And I take it that absorbing the blows or the ammunition of some principality or some notion of evil isn't necessarily going to do that, or at least something more would need to be said about how that's brought about.
Well, fair enough to say that there are many problems that need to be solved in order for us to have optimal relationships with God.
Yeah, good.
That's true. There are many problems. I mean, there have been many labels for this, right? Justification, sanctification,
Right.
blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Right? So, but that's not to say that there's no mechanism to explain victory, or that there's no mechanism to explain what ransom might mean. And
Yeah,
one might
right.
say, well, okay, getting them out of bondage is step one, and step two is, moving them along and transforming them as persons and transforming the relationship and so forth, and that takes more work. And we think that Christ and the Holy Spirit are involved in that too, and we need some more story about that. But that's a separate point, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, I suppose I want to include that separate point as part of what it is that Christ's work brings about, at least to some extent. So on my way of thinking, talking about Christ's work being the absorbing of, the ammunition of the powers of evil or something like that, is indeed part of potentially part of an account of the atonement, a full-orbed, we might say, a full-orbed account of the atonement. But it's not clear to me that that's sufficient. There needs to be something else, something to do with the restoration of my relationship with God, reconciliation with God, and that has to be brought. There has to be something that Christ does in order to make that possible. That's the point I'm trying to make. Yeah, justification and so on are things that happen as a consequence of Christ's work on the atonement. They're not that work of atonement. At least it seems to me.
Well, true. I mean, it's true that there are lots of things that have to be done to make
Yeah.
your relationship with God optimal.
Right.
That's right. And on many different theories. I mean, that's true on Anselm's theory, right?
Right. Right.
You know, Christ makes satisfaction.
Yeah.
But that's not the end of the story.
Sure.
Then there's the spiritual rehab that needs
Right.
to happen before you're fit to see God and so forth.
Yeah.
And there are many different labels for this and categories. So I guess that might suggest that the idea of ransom or victory are incomplete.
Yes,
which
exactly.
is one of your claims.
Yeah.
But that's different from the claim of vacuity or that it's simply metaphorical or something.
My queue is growing. So
Okay,
if you
okay,
take the
sure,
last word
yeah,
on this, and
okay.
then we'll move on to Sam.
Okay, thanks very much, Marilyn.
Sam.
Thanks, Oliver. So maybe I'll come at this from the opposite that Marilyn just launched. So I guess I am sympathetic with your criticisms of ransom theory. My worry is that, in light of what you said today and what I've read, I have very similar worries about federalist theories, about penal substitution theories, frankly about just about every theory I've read of the atonement. Namely, I can sort of poke some holes in the mechanism and make it seem like it's trading on metaphor where it's supposed to be providing some deeper explanation. It's a singular event, et cetera. So I wondered if you could just help me understand better the demand for a mechanism that you are presupposing when you say, like, well, we want a doctrine. We don't want a mere motif, I suppose. Why? Could you say a bit more about what you're thinking is like behind this demand for some kind of mechanism?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I mean, I suppose one might say, look, there are circumstances in which providing various pictures of the atonement, which may be fuzzy on exactly how it is that Christ's work atones for sin, are nevertheless appropriate. And I'm perfectly prepared to accept that. I mean, there may be all sorts of pastoral situations or perhaps liturgical contexts in which what's being said about the atonement performs another sort of function. So that the faithful, as they come to pray or to come to worship, perhaps are looking for something different than a mechanism for atonement, reassured, theologically about mechanism for atonement. So there may be contexts in which it's appropriate to not drill down, as it were, and to just let the metaphors, and indeed we find, as I quoted from the New Testament, we find these metaphors in Scripture. So I mean, I can hardly complain about that. But in terms of what it is I'm looking for, I suppose what I'm wanting to know is, what is it about this person's death that is more than just a political tragedy, or more than just some horrific form of torture that was undergone by many other human beings under the rule of the Roman Empire? What is it about this person's death that is able to affect other human beings, not merely in a sense of us being empathetic or sympathetic to his plight, but in some way that brings about my reconciliation with God, if that's the claim that Christians are making. And it seems to me that that is the claim that Christians are making about atonement, that it's about reconciliation with God. So if sin interposes between us and God, some kind of barrier or moral gulf that needs to be bridged, and if we are incapable of bridging that ourselves, and if Christ comes in order to bridge that gap somehow, then I'm trying to get at what it is that's doing that bridging. Now, it may be that we can't get at the whole of it. We can't have a complete explanation. It may function in that way, dogmatically speaking, a bit like, say, the Trinity or the hypostatic union. It's a mystery, okay? There are certain things that we can figure out, certain things that are revealed to us, certain things that our human understanding is able to penetrate, but there's a kind of boundary beyond which we can't go. There are just things we can't understand, at least not this side of death or this stage of our development or whatever story you might tell about why it is we can't understand these things. Maybe there's something about how it is that atonement is brought about by this person's action that is mysterious. But my sense is that many Christians down through the ages have thought, though that is true, nevertheless, we can say certain things about this that give us a sense that we're involved in a kind of faith-seeking understanding project. That we might not see all of it. Now we see dimly as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face and so on, but we can see some of it. The sum of it is what I'm trying to get at. So I hope I didn't convey some sort of grand notion that I can figure out the doctrine of atonement. Not at all. I don't think that at all. But to try and get clearer on how it is that Christ's life, death, and resurrection brings about human salvation, that, it seems to me, requires something like a mechanism. We might think mechanism is a little too crass, but something is going on there. Some transaction is going on. Some act of reconciliation, perhaps, if you don't like transaction language, that bridges the gulf. That's really what it's about.
Ben.
Thanks, Oliver. You've really provoked us into thinking about the mechanism, so I'm going to have a go as well. And can I just piggyback on the back of David Congdon's remarks earlier? Because I think there is a... So this is not a... I mean, I fully share your criticisms of Allen's account and so on. Yeah. But I think there is a patristic mechanism which hasn't been mentioned here, and I think you can find it running in the Greek tradition, running from Irenaeus right through to the 4th century, and it's spelled out with analytic clarity in Athanasius on the Incarnation.
Yeah.
And so the missing ingredient that we haven't talked about is the relation between an impassible logos and corruptible, passible, dying human nature. So the way just briefly, the way Athanasius spells this out is that because the whole of human nature, so you've got this realistic conception of one human nature, because all of that has now become corruptible and liable to death. God cannot make contact with death because God is impassible. So death is like, it would just be a contradiction. It's like trying to bring two positive sides of a magnet together or something. So the only way that the impassible logos can make contact with death is by assuming passible human nature. So that's the kind of cur deus homo. This is why you need an incarnation, is so that it's a solution to the problem of impassibility. Then the reason you need a death then is that impassible logos now touches death. And in touching, when death consumes that one human body, it actually makes contact with the impassible logos, the life-giving creative logos, and therefore death dies. So it's the Athanasian thing is about the death of death, and therefore the release of the whole of human nature, from Adam on, from the power of death. And I think generally in the patristic tradition, it's death and mortality that are much more fundamental problems than sin or Satan or any of that business, or guilt. And this is basically what Gregory of Nyssa is illustrating when he uses the fish. It's not about Satan or a ransom. It's about the way in which when one human person makes contact with death, by accident, death touches the divine logos and is extinguished because the logos is a life-giving. So it's not like death is an entity. It's just a negative that's cancelled out, if you like, once the logos is there. So in summary, I think there is a mechanism here of the how, and that mechanism involves the following ingredients: divine impassibility, a realistic conception of a single human nature, the incarnation with the communication of properties, so that, yeah, that's the iron and the fire business, and a death, the death of the God-man. So those are the ingredients of the mechanism. And then the results of this one, I'm nearly finished, but the results, once the mechanism has happened, the results are Christ's resurrection, the resurrection and freedom of that one human nature from death's power and from corruptibility, union with Christ because of the fact that there is only one human nature which the Logos unites with, and therefore union with the divine nature. So that's my take on how the patristic thing works.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I like Athanasius' on the incarnation for all sorts of reasons. It's got a bit of a vicarious motif going on as well, of course. But I don't know. I mean, it sounds to me like that's a sort of variation on what J.N.D. Kelly calls the physical account of the atonement, or at least something in the neighborhood of that. I'm still not clear on what you've just said, how it is that the human nature assumed in the hypostatic union, once all this stuff has happened to it, is capable of transferring the kind of upshot of that process to us. Is that because somehow we're all united to Christ as a kind of metaphysical whole, the kind of realist stuff I was talking about earlier?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So it's a mix between the communication of properties and the realistic conception.
Yeah.
Because it's, there's only one human nature.
Okay, that's the bit I'm a little bit fuzzy on, but I think I can see how it could work if the idea is that a particular human nature, Christ's human nature, in hypostatic union with the second person of the Trinity, brings about these actions, but because we're somehow metaphysically or mystically united to his human nature, the benefits of what happens to that one nature is then somehow transferred to the other parts of this metaphysical whole that are scattered across space-time, something like that. That's unfortunate for me, because it sounds like Athanasius has already solved the problem. Well,
He does if you have all those
yeah, right. So,
based on 1 Corinthians 15,
yeah,
it's the Adamite.
yeah, right. Yeah, that sounds very suggestive. That's really helpful. Thank you, yeah.
We still have several people in the queue and only 7 minutes, so I urge you now to talk at high speed. Amber.
Thanks. So, as somebody who's worked very minimally on the atonement, I'm not going to ask the kind of educated, scholarly question. I want to ask kind of the naive undergraduate question. And it has to do with, so apart from my own qualms about phrasing these things in terms of war and embattlement and so on, which do have historical and biblical grounding, I guess,
Right.
it's a question about not just how Christ's death can be construed as a ransom and how that could be construed as a mechanism for victory or something like that, but rather what ransom has to do with victory in the first place. So I think in everyday language, we have this kind of idea that ransom is so the person who is held hostage is not guilty. It's an innocent victim. And then somebody has to, pay some price. But the optimal outcome is to get the person back without having to pay the price.
Yeah.
So ransom represents this kind of less than optimal outcome. And so I'm wondering why we would even want to associate ransom with victory, except insofar as it's a suboptimal way of getting what we want, kind of.
Yeah. You're a pretty clever undergraduate, I have to tell you. Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess that goes back to some of the things that Marilyn's saying, in a sense. I mean, maybe the thing to do is to separate out these two things. So you've got victory, which is, on my way of thinking, is something like the upshot of what Christ's work achieves. And ransom is something else. It's a motif that may or may not be sort of juxtaposed next to the notion of victory. But maybe the idea then is something like this. The victory comes about through Christ absorbing the ammunition being fired at him by evil. This, includes his perfect life, death, and resurrection as components of one whole work. And in enduring that particular state of humiliation, death, and resurrection, he somehow is said to pay the price necessary for us to go free. And maybe it's something like he stands in our place in order to absorb that attack of evil so that we don't have to, and God may then forgive us. Do you see what I'm getting at? So he stands there, and evil does its work against Christ. He is therefore victorious over the powers of evil on the one hand, in his resurrection. And on the other hand, because he stands there in place of us, God doesn't have to allow us to suffer those consequences. We may be either forgiven or have the benefits of Christ's work transferred to us, something like that.
Myron.
But I agree with you. I think on reflection is a little puzzling. Yeah.
Myron.
Thanks for your paper, Oliver.
Sure.
I really liked how you began with the typology of the, distinguishing between the idea of atonement and a model and a doctrine and a theory and a mechanism and a motif and a conjecture and a happy thought and all the different ways you can figure into what I assume we're aiming at, though, is a doctrine, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the end game.
That's right.
And your emphasis on mechanism, though, made me think that, well, what kind of mechanism you're looking for depends on what the end game is. Mm-hmm. And so it made me question, well, why are we looking for a doctrine of the atonement? Like, what if we change the language to focus on a doctrine of the victory of God? Mm-hmm. And then the mechanism you're looking for is going to be different, because you're going to ask now, well, what's the mechanism by which we achieve atonement, but actually what's the mechanism by which we achieve victory?
Right.
And what a victory is going to depend on what game you're playing. Mm-hmm. And if the game is to bring about reconciliation or to bring about communion with God, then perhaps ransom is a mechanism by which you can achieve that, right? It's a way in which a captive is released and brought back to their loved ones, in this case, their God. Uh-huh. And that's just the goal. The goal isn't atonement per se. The goal is victory, and the game is that you're playing is communion with God. Right?
Yeah.
So
that sounds like a kind of partial defense of a sort of Weaver view. But I mean, why would you need ransom on that view? That's what I'm not clear about. I mean, why can't you simply say Christ's work is a phase in this larger scheme of bringing about God's reign in history? So you could have the victory stuff, the victory language, but you just drop, the ransom just drops out. I see, okay. So, okay, right, so we're captive to some power or
in order to be a captive, you need a captor. So I think you're right to kind of push, different options for filling in the captor role.
Yeah.
Seem weird and all that problem.
Yeah.
So maybe we are captive to ourselves. There's a way of making
Right, okay, yeah, good. Yeah, that may make a little bit more sense. So maybe fill in the blank on who the captor is. We're captives that need Christ to liberate us. And so it's Godzilla again. Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, maybe. But then of course, then it looks to me like, as you said in your question, the story you're telling is one which is looking for a different kind of outcome. And maybe that's my concern. So maybe I should rephrase it in terms of that. The outcome I'm looking for is somewhat different than something like what Denny Weaver's looking for. And yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, I hope I'm not. I hope I haven't mischaracterized Weaver, because I try terribly hard. I think it's terribly important to be charitable to those who you disagree with. So maybe he's on something like that kind of a trajectory, where he's thinking that the reign of God is the outcome, not necessarily, or at least not in the same central way, this notion of reconciliation that I'm trying to get at. Thank you, yeah.
My apologies to those still in the queue. Please remember to come back at 6:30 for the reception in Indigo C, and let's thank our speaker.
Good.
Is this being part of the book that you're doing?
Well, I hope so. Yeah, it might get. I think we usually publish the lecture in the journal, so it might come in the journal first. But
Sure, right.
a successor anyway. Yeah. I mean, I've had some great feedback here, so I hope I can incorporate some of that.
I think Ben's absolutely right though about the
Yeah, that was really helpful.
patristic theory.
Yeah, that was really
It's all
helpful.
about death.
And you know what I found is, it's like a lot of these things, I suppose. You know, I spend a lot of time reading like the Protestant scholastics, and you sort of gradually work your way, at least I do. Then you read some medievals, and then you finally get back to the patristic and think, oh, actually,
It's a different thought world.
it's a different thought world, but also...